Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our, what do you call it, our every other week, when we're not in the session, Friday legislative update. We are excited to have you here. We're excited because we've got a special guest who's going to be helping us deliver information in a little while. We are recording this, as I think you know. I'm Mark Tallman, and I will let our other KASB speakers introduce themselves.
I'm Leah Fleiter. I'm Director of Governmental Relations.
And I'm Scott Rothschild. I'm Communications Editor.
And we have some other KSB staff members who I'm sure if they feel compelled will also jump in if they need to. We're going to introduce our guest when we get to kind of her part of the presentation shortly. Do we want to bring up the screen?
If I can find it, yes. There we go. Okay, can everybody see it?
I cannot.
Okay, let me try again.
As Lee is working that, I'll kind of give you a sense of what our program is going to be for today. We're going to talk about some new guidance from the State Department of Education on school reopening issues and the governor's order. A very quick recap of election news from this week. Most of our program is going to be devoted to some of the federal funding to help with COVID-related expenses, particularly the SPARKS money and the SPARKS process that we are dealing with. A little on federal issues. Here we go. And then some of the usual things we wrap up with. As always, we want you to be prepared to use the chat feature, which hopefully you've all, the pandemic has done nothing but teach us how to use chat. Hopefully it has done that. So again, with the group we have now, we'll ask you to put questions throughout the program as you have them, but if you can kind of group them around topic, that's where we would want to be. So here's our agenda of the things we'll be looking at. And Leah, if you want to move to the slide, next slide, we'll get right into it. First thing we would note is that yesterday, the Department of Education put out some guidance or some answers to frequently asked questions on the governor's executive order 2059, if I remember correctly. We don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just because they've put it out, we're going to quickly highlight. If you do have questions, we'll try to either respond now or direct you where to go. And there was maybe about 10 questions they responded to. And the very first one goes back to the issue of whether county commissions can opt out of this. And KSDE's legal opinion is legal opinions vary. And that simply means that the governor believes that commissions cannot opt out. Others suggest that they can. We understand that some have taken that action, but that has not yet been challenged at any level that we're aware of. The Attorney General has been asked for an opinion as of this morning. One had not been issued. And the Department of Education is basically saying they believe you should follow the navigating change guidance at a minimum. So that's probably the big news is we still don't have a definitive answer, I guess, to that question. Very quickly, a few other things. Where that order requires people in K-12 schools to wear masks, what does that mean? It means anywhere students attend school, whether your district owns the building or not, or whether, and this also applies to private schools, the only place it wouldn't apply are field trips when you're at a place that's clearly not in any way controlled by the district. The mask order does apply to preschool students. In fact, any students of your district, no matter what the age, if you count them as students, regardless of age, the mask mandate applies according to this order. Do you have to wear them during PE or physical activity? There is an exemption or an exception if there are unsafe circumstances or it's impossible to do so. That's all it says. You'd have to make that local call. Are masks required for students with special health needs? There's a specific exception in the order for health needs for certain special education students, students with disabilities. The next slide. If you maintain 6 feet social distancing in classrooms, do you still have to wear the mask? Yes. Are you require social distancing for students when they're eating? Yes. They do not have to wear masks when they're eating, fortunately, I guess, but you are required to maintain the social distancing. It requires hand sanitizing once an hour. Is there a difference between hand sanitizing and hand washing? That is not defined in the order. Can you take the temperature of students on the bus before they get to school to meet the daily temperature requirement? Yes, you may. Can you take temperature in the hallway before entering the classroom? No, you must take the temperature before the students or anyone entering the building for the first time that day must have their temperature taken. Do you have to record those temperatures? No, you do not. So those are the questions. There's a little more detail. Leah, was there another slide that we
Yeah,
could?
there
Yes,
you go.
thank you. Leah, you want to explain what's available here?
Sure. KASB has a number of resources that we are supplying to help you with your reopening decisions. If you go to our website, kasb.org, and click on the roadmap to reopening photo, it will bring you to a page this page that you see on the screen. And there's a number of resources there, including, you can see at that first link under the picture, KSDE FAQs on Executive Order 20-59, and that's what Mark was just referring to in his comments.
We do have a chat question. Is there an exception for 3- and 4-year-olds at a separate building that is used for early childhood programming? My understanding, Bryce, and I don't have the order in front of me, is that the exception is for non-students who are under 5. If you have like a school operated daycare program where you are not counting the kids as students, they would not be covered. So this may be a different interpretation. Obviously, we'd invite you to pursue this further. We don't have one of our attorneys on today, but my recollection of the order is if you are counting them as students, they must wear masks. If they are in a program you operate not as K-12 students in effect, then it may not apply in a different building. So that's the best answer I can give you. But again, look at the details of that, and if you need to get further clarification, I think the intention is if it's a completely separate building, maybe that exception is made available, even if you're counting them as students. But a lot of the questions I think have come around, well, what if our district has a child care program of some kind? Okay. Leah, I don't see other questions at this point. So we just wanted to very briefly share you some data that we collected over the past couple of weeks, but after our last update. These charts are visualizations of the difference, I guess, COVID has made between last year and this year in terms of when school starts. The first chart on the left shows the percent of districts, or the percent of kids when they start by kind of week in August. So a year ago, 85% of Kansas students started school in the first or second week of August. This year, it will be 11%. Last year, less than 1% of students started after Labor Day. This year, it is almost 60%. Now, the shift is not quite as big if you look at by district, because many of our largest districts in the state made the shift to go after Labor Day. But even here, last year, 60% of school districts started the first or second week in August. This year, that dropped to 33%, almost cut in half. As you can see, about 38% of districts will start the third week of August, 11% will start the fourth week of August. So only 17% of districts are starting after Labor Day, but that's almost 60% of students in the state. So what this, I think, shows is when the state board did not adopt the governor's order and left it to local control resulted in a lot of different decisions, but many districts did, in fact, move the start date back at least some degree from where they were a year ago. Any questions on that? Okay, seeing none. Leah?
All right.
Leah, why don't you, please fill us in here.
I think we'll do a quick analysis here of the August 4th primary. That was Tuesday. And you can find the unofficial results at the Secretary of State's new and spiffier and easier to use elections page on the website. And you can see the link there. The results are still unofficial because they are still counting advance ballots, mail-in ballots, and there were a particularly high number of those types of ballots submitted this year. So there are a few races that are still pending because they have a very close margin. And so those will not be finalized until the Secretary of State counts all the ballots and their county election office finishes the canvass there. But on Tuesday, Mark and Scott and I did a quick analysis of the, we did on Wednesday, we did the analysis of the Tuesday primary vote, and you can find that on our website. We posted the PowerPoint on our key resources page. So you go to KASB.org, then click on advocacy, and then click on key resources. We also converted that presentation to a video. It's on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our main webpage. And we also converted it to a podcast. The general, I guess, observation that we would make in the wake of the August 4th primary is that based on what we have seen thus far, the trend has gone back towards a little bit more of a conservative trend as far as the races that were decided on Tuesday. There were 30-some that were decided, but there are a few that still remain to be decided in the primary. And then, of course, there are a number of very important races that will be settled on November 3rd in the general election. Mark or Scott, do you have anything you want to add to that very quick recap?
Well, I think, especially in the state Senate, we saw, I believe, 6 Republican incumbents who were defeated, who had been elected in 2016 and were pretty instrumental in the efforts to repeal Governor Sam Brownback's tax cuts. Though that action pretty much put our state back on good financial footing. Of course, that has changed since the COVID pandemic. But 6 of those, and I think you would call them moderate Republicans, were defeated by more conservative Republicans. In a couple of those races, they will probably face pretty stiff Democratic challenges, but in several of those races, they have switched to a more conservative bent.
Okay, we've got a question about resources to talk to candidates, and I think that's on the next slide.
No, we just wanted to remind you. We just wanted to remind you that the next deadline you need to be aware of is October 13th. That's the last day to register to vote in the general election, and then advance voting in person or by mail starts the very next day, October 14th. So be sure to vote, whether it's in person on the day or in advance, either at your polling station or by mail. Resources to discuss with candidates and others. Mark has prepared a very good 15-minute video that we've posted on our YouTube channel, and he's also converted that to a podcast. It's Kansas K-12 education issues for the 2020 general election. It gives you a nice overview of the issues that legislators and school board members are going to want to be aware of as we move towards the general election and then to the convening of the 2021 Kansas legislative session. That answer the person's question who was in the chat?
I hope so. And Claudia, if you have other questions or need other resources, please let us know. I think we also have a document on our website that is just kind of a text version, but we would encourage you, if you haven't done so, to watch the video and get my count number of views up. And certainly you would be welcome to share that also with the candidate or direct it to that as well.
Okay, any more questions before we move on? Okay. All right, Mark, we're going to turn it over to you to talk about SPARK.
Okay, and again, we will welcome your questions as we go through, and we're going to kind of in the middle of this turn to our guest who's going to kind of help with her observations. Some of you may be hearing about SPARK, maybe that's why you turned in. I have not yet completely memorized that it stands for Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas, which has a task force and lots of committees, and basically it is a heroic effort to try to spend an awful lot of money very quickly that was provided by the federal government. And so what we're going to do is kind of tell you where we are in that process. And our guest is going to probably offer some insights of what is going on at the local level. So Lee, if you want to go to the next slide. So what basically Kansas received $10.5 billion in federal funding under the CARES Act, which was passed last spring. And this little chart kind of shows you that it's divided into several areas. The bottom part, business and community, and then above that you see healthcare and food. All of those are things like, you know, the stimulus payments, unemployment compensation, direct aid for healthcare. So the bottom line is, out of all this funding, I would just call your attention on this chart where it says education, $200 million off to the side. That includes the $84 million for K-12 education that went directly to school districts that your district should have already been notified about, that was distributed based on your Title I and special education funding. So that's outside of the SPARKS process. There was also some money provided directly to local governments. The little orange bar at the top that says CRF stands for Coronavirus Relief Fund, $1.2 billion. That's the money that basically SPARKS is responsible for. And of that, on the right side of this slide, you can see that because of their size, Johnson and Sedgwick County directly receive money from the federal government out of that $1.2 billion. That leaves a little over $1 billion that went to the state to decide how to spend. So if you move to the next slide, what this then shows is the state, the SPARK committee, which is kind of in the governor's office but requires some legislative oversight, has basically divided that money into 3 rounds. The first round went, $400 million went to counties for local uses, and they have wide discretion on what to do with that. The second round, $314 million, is kind of in the process of being approved for specific projects that are being recommended by the governor and the SPARKS committee, but have to be approved by the state finance council. That will leave a little under $300 million in round 3 that is not spoken for. And we're going to talk about what might happen with that money. The key to remember is this money is supposed to be spent, or at least dedicated, by the end of this year, by end of December of 2020, and can only be used for purposes that in some way tie back to the COVID pandemic, that can be sort of justified around the needs created by that. So all of your counties should have received by July 20th the $400 million in round 1. And we're in the process of the next 2 rounds. And what COVID is basically saying, or the committee is saying, that they're trying to divide the money into kind of two broad categories: the immediate costs of dealing with the pandemic, and lasting investments, which are things that were maybe prompted by or caused by the pandemic, but would have longer lasting uses. And we will try to explain that in a moment. So that's kind of the overview, about $1 billion, 3 pots of money at 3 different stages. Next slide, please. So another way to visualize it is school, and let's talk about where schools are in this. So schools receive direct aid that are not part of the SPARKS process or the CRF, $86 million. That's already been allocated separate. Phase 1 went to counties, but school districts may apply for funding to reimburse expenses. So this is money that your county allocates, but districts may apply for those dollars. Many of you may be doing so. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about. There may still be money available, but that's the first phase. The second phase is allocated into 4 areas: healthcare, economic development, and education. But the education money does not include K-12, because the SPARKS committee argued that the $86 million that went to school districts sort of takes care of them. At least that was their view. It also includes $60 million for connectivity, which is basically around broadband. School districts can work with local officials and providers to apply for that money. You don't have to, but you can. So if you're in an area where you're not well served or you've got needs, that $60 million is going to go out. If it's approved Monday by the State Finance Council, that will be available to basically go to local organizations and providers to expand broadband coverage. And the third page is not yet determined. The Sparks process is seeking input. One thing that has been talked about is to use some of this money to fund additional school finance costs for at-risk students caused by the economic impact of the pandemic. There's also discussion of using some of that money for more broadband support. And if school leaders have ideas, you should be thinking about them and preparing to communicate them, but they have to in some way be tied back to COVID expenditures. Next slide. So now our much publicized guest speaker here, Monica Murnan, whose day job most of the year is Director of Student Support Services at the Greenbush Service Center, who also serves her constituents as a state representative, and for our purposes has been working in her area with school districts and counties about how to use that money. And we thought she would be a great person to kind of talk about what's happening. She doesn't have a big presentation or slides. She says she'd mostly like to answer your questions, but Representative Monica, please share some thoughts in this area.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me today. I have a little bit of feedback. Do I need to do something differently, Mark?
We hear you just fine, so the feedback must be on your end.
Okay, so if I hesitate, it's because I'm trying not to hear myself. So I'm really happy to join you today. I've been a frequent watcher of these get-togethers, and so it's a real honor to be asked to share some thoughts with you of lessons learned as we've gone through this SPARK process and how it impacts school districts. Most of the time I can sort my life out and I can say this is my real job and this is my legislative job, and this is one of those projects that's had a little bit of overlap. Because what has happened as those opportunities and dollars came into, Mark, I heard some noise. I'm going to confirm you can still hear me.
We can, you're fine.
Okay, thank you. So as these dollars rolled into counties, they were kind of a bit of a panic, and what a great panic to have. That in my county of Crawford County, we had $7.9 million come in. And for most counties in Kansas who do not have a paid county administrator, this became kind of a mixed blessing because it's a very complex process. While it's the opportunities to use the funds are quite wide, the reporting is continually going to be a challenge because as the requirements from the federal government change through the State SPARK Committee and then down into counties, there's a little bit of hesitation in moving forward. But the bottom line is there is no choice. So you have probably heard from someone in your county that they received these dollars. They have already arrived in the counties. The county treasurer has them in their accounts. And they must be used very, very quickly. So next Saturday, August the 15th, counties have to submit a very complex plan that says, how are you going to use the money and start reconciling what they have spent those dollars for. By September 15th, there's a pretty significant deadline saying, hey, if there's not much movement here, this will be the first opportunity for the state to draw the money back in to the state coffers and redistribute somewhere else. So the motivation to get moving is quite high in most counties. The way to do it is defined widely. The county commissioners have the discretion of how to use the funds. They have guidelines. The Kansas Association of Counties, your counterpart here with school boards, has played a very large advocacy role in coordinating with the governor's office, the Office of Recovery, and making sure that counties have access to the most updated information as well as sharing of ideas. One of the key things that I noticed early on with school districts is in school districts, we tend to think about our formula. We tend to think about categorical aid when it comes to special ed. We occasionally think about outside grant sources. In small communities, that may be something as simple as, you know, getting money from the local Rotary Foundation. But oftentimes we don't think much farther outside of that. And so what I have seen happening in a lot of counties is that they are actively requesting input from their school districts. Early on, one of the requirements was that reimbursements, school districts were one of the identified entities that school districts had to address. But as you well know, many school districts were able to cover some of those PPE costs and those other COVID-related costs with the CARES money that Mark articulated in his chart. So what ended up happening is school districts, some of them said, you know, we're good, we really can't take anymore because that would be, you know, double dipping in essence. But the beauty of this project is it's not just about reimbursement, it's about what the state is calling direct aid, which basically means what do you need to do to navigate COVID from August 1 to December 31. Now, many school districts also turn their head and kind of get a little worried when they have to spend funds by the end of December, because we think of our budgets in terms of a school year. And oftentimes won't venture into that world because it involves salaries and they don't want to have to let somebody go at the end of December. So we really encouraged school districts to think a little bit bigger and a little bit outside of the box. There are 4 major categories of what SPARK is using these funds for. The first one is making yourself whole. So in school districts, that would be going back and recouping some of those costs that you didn't have covered. But another area is economic development, healthcare, and connectivity, more of the idea of building resilience. Connectivity in the essence of technology, but also in the essence of our communities and making sure we're all connected so that if this shutdown kind of situation happens again, or we continue on as we have, that it'll be a little easier to bounce back. So I really think that school districts have done a nice job in thinking a little bit bigger. Let me give you some examples. And I want you to know, even though the deadline is quickly approaching, please, please, if you have not already, reach out to your county commissioners. Even if you do not have a county administrator, you need to be connecting with your county administrator. Every county was required to identify a lead person. In my county, it's the county counselor. In neighboring Bourbon County, it's the economic development director. But make sure they know your school district is ready and willing to participate and look at new ideas. Even though that deadline is coming up quickly, that's not the end. That is when counties have to supply their plan. So it's not the end, but it is a quickly approaching deadline. Some of the things we've talked about school districts and use of these funds is, what do you need to do in the area of mental health to ensure that your kids who haven't been in a classroom since March have that social emotional support that they need to be successful in school, or to be successful socially and emotionally as they learn virtually? Is that a contract with your local public health department or a for-profit, whatever that might be? What do you need to get those supports? Do you need to get your teachers some more training about that, especially as we look to families that previously we wouldn't consider economically disadvantaged, but now they are? The unemployment rates alone should frighten every teacher in the state of Kansas, because kids who left you in March with nice supports around them may indeed not have those anymore. We've also encouraged school districts to look at how they can, with connectivity, using other community partners. So in one community that I know, they're looking at how the city and the school district can work together to increase fiber access. And then also we have really highly encouraged looking at early childhood. So one of the components of the resilient community is that we look to how are we ensuring that if kids aren't with us in school, what safe environments are they in? So in childcare settings, either our 0 to 5 kids or our big school age kids. So what can our school districts do to partner with a childcare provider and then maybe provide virtual learning during that time? And then the final thing is not necessarily looking at ourselves as a district as somebody as receiving funds, but what can the school district bring to the table in informing the county plan? So oftentimes county folks, local elected officials at the county level and those at the school board level aren't really necessarily communicating. There's oftentimes not a reason to do that. This is a reason. You know where kids are. You know what family needs are. You know what access looks like. So I would really encourage you to see yourself as a resource and offer yourself up to the county during this time. And also cannot stress enough the importance of always having a wish list handy and ready for your district. If we had all the money in the world, what would we put into play here? And how much would it cost? And being able to pull that off quickly. It is amazing how many people you offer funds to and they say, well, I really don't know what I'd use them for. Well, you need to be a little more creative, is what I say to that. And so having a quick list that can be pulled out. So as we near the end of this calendar year and somebody from the county calls and says, hey, we've got another 100,000 of Spark funds that we haven't used yet. You guys got any ideas? That you're ready to help solve their problem for them. So with Mark, with that, I will shush and see what questions anybody has.
So we have the first one that I see, getting conflicting information. What is the deadline?
Yeah, so every county can set their own deadline for it. So some counties have just decided where the money's going to go. The county commissioners just got in a meeting and said, this school district's going to get 50, our health department's going to get 50, da 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 da. Others have gone through actual processes. So where I live, there was an open grant application. The county divided the money into buckets. Education got this much, healthcare got this much, early childhood got this much, collaborative projects got this much, and so forth. So the actual deadline for the county to tell the state what their plan is August 15th. That's the county's deadline. And then the actual to expend funds, that indeed changes. So this particular section for counties holds a 2 times a week webinar, and the rules change every 2 times, which happens with federal funds, right? But I am telling school districts, you need to have that money spent by the end of December as for the final deadline.
We'll see if there's some other questions. I'll just make one note and see if I'm right on this, because I had the opportunity today to view the county webinar for the first time. And one of the things they said is you have to have a plan, but that plan can change. And
Yes.
there's a review process. So again, all the more reason to stay in touch with the process. Your need may move forward, it may move up, they may not end up not spending money as they thought. So being ready and being part of the process is what's critical, right?
I agree.
And I would also echo again, and welcoming any other questions on the early childhood in that round 2. And I said there was an education piece. Part of that piece was directed to early childhood and to provide supports there, but would strongly agree you need to be aware of what that could mean in your community as you try to partnership with other providers and with what you may be trying to do as a district to meet those needs. There's potentially dollars coming in that won't go to K-12 specifically, but can help support that early childhood foundation for your district.
Absolutely. I just got off a webinar about that. And I see that that's supporting that whole network. Just as a quick reminder, the 0 to 5 network sometimes is structured like a school district, but most times in Kansas, children are in care or in pre-K in non-school based settings. And that setting is not funded like schools are. It has a high turnover. It has low pay, and oftentimes school districts kind of struggle saying, I don't even know who these folks are. Well, every school district superintendent in the state of Kansas can request a list of licensed child care providers and pre-Ks in their school district from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And if you want to make this opportunity to connect, you can for sure do that. The person that you email at Kansas Department of Health and Environment, her name is Mary Murphy. How easy is that to remember? And she can get you the list of licensed providers so that you can start building those relationships if you already haven't.
Well, not seeing other questions right now. Let's proceed. We've got a couple more slides in this area, but if people do have questions before Monica leaves us, so we'll be happy to take them. I'm going to bring down my chat screen and just point out. So I talked about that phase 2 connectivity funding. There's $60 million recommended. 50 million would be grants for broadband development in underserved areas. So that's the biggest part of that money. Also, $10 million would be made available to provide assistance to low-income populations. So basically, this is designed both to expand the infrastructure, to get the broadband out there, and some resources to help people who can't afford it, even if it's there. Our understanding is this will go, this was reviewed by the Legislative Budget Committee Monday. It will go to the State Finance Council, which is the governor and legislative leaders, on Monday. So that's the final piece of phase 2. Next slide. And then also should note, Leah drafted a letter of support. As many of you probably know, one of the things we've heard, well, for years, but certainly when we had to go to continuous learning last spring, is that one of the biggest problems we have is kids not having access. And the latest estimates are that over 150,000 Kansas kids do not have reliable home broadband internet. So in our advocacy role, KASB has written a letter to the State Finance Council urging them to support these efforts to do this. Is this PowerPoint available? Yes, we will put, in fact, if someone can put it in the chat, we'll also put it on our resource page. And if you ever need this and can't find any other way, just email one of us and we will send it to you.
I'll also post it on our key resources page when we're done here today.
Right. Next slide, Leah. So what are the next steps? And these are just slides I was able to pull from the many presentations that the Sparks people have made. In August, you can see they're beginning work on what they want to do in round 3. And there's also the process of reviewing the progress on round 2. At the bottom, there's this little countdown to December 30th. I guess they're not going to spend money on the 31st because all of these say you have to spend the money before New Year's Eve. The next slide for September, we would just note that they're talking about having some process for stakeholder input. So this is why we're saying, if you've got some great ideas on how to spend that final $300 million, there's going to be opportunity to share that. But I think I can say you will be heard more if you're able to talk about this with other community partners or other groups and how this money can be spent to be kind of lasting investments. Next slide, moving into October, just kind of shows you that's when they'll start looking at the round 3 selections. And then the final slide in this area, I think that's really the last one. That's when you kind of have to have money out the door. And just would note, we also have resources where you can find this information as part of our roadmap for reopening sites. So keep those in mind. We've also provided some listing to Kansas Association of Counties websites and information. So that's a link that can help you get more information if you need it. I'm going to check the chat one more time. Yes, so we've answered that. Next slide. Okay, so this kind of concludes our formal presentation on Spark, but again, if Monica can stay with us, just in case you have any questions you haven't thought of, I'm going to turn back to Leah to talk about the census and just a few other items before we wrap up.
Thanks, Mark. You may have heard this week that the federal government has decided to amend the deadline for filling out your 2020 census. The deadline had been pushed to October 31st because of the pandemic, but now that has been pushed back or up, depending on how you might look at that, to September 30th. So If you have folks in your district, in your area, who have not responded to the census, this is a great time to encourage them to do that. Census helps determine the fate of and the direction of $6 billion in federal funding to Kansas. And for our purposes, you know, for K-12 education, that includes Title I services, IDEA, school nutrition, SNAP, a number of critical components of your community's public schools. And our Kansas response rate right now is at 65%, which is actually slightly better than the nationwide average. But if you think about that, that's not quite a third of the folks in Kansas have not yet been counted. And so we are not to the point where, you know, we are going to be getting all of that federal funding that we're really entitled to. You pay taxes, some of those taxes go to the federal government, and that comes back to you in the form of federal funding that's determined by the census. You know, if you live in a large county, even some of our largest counties have about a third of their folks that are undercounted. So if you live in a high population county, you should be encouraging your folks, your parents, your stakeholders to fill out that census form. Even if you live in a small county, you also need to have people fill out that form, because services that are so critical to our small and rural areas are also determined by an accurate census count. And so one thing that we would like to suggest you might want to think about doing here in the push to the final deadline of September 30th is perhaps put a link or this graphic on your district homepage, or perhaps, you know, you're taking registrations now. Many of you are giving people the option to register online. Perhaps you just want to post that little my2020census.gov website and encourage people to fill out that form in order for our schools and our other critical services to receive the funding that really we're all entitled to as taxpayers. Any questions about the census? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. I'm going to touch real quickly on federal advocacy. As you know, the CARES Act has been the bill that the law that we've primarily been referring to, and Mark's already mentioned it today. It was passed in March and funneled quite a bit of funding to K-12 public schools. However, as you all know, you've seen even more costs, and you're looking at additional costs as you work towards reopening here in the next few weeks. The Association of School Superintendents and the Association of School Business Officers put together this graphic that says the average school district could spend up to at least $1.7 million for reopening costs, depending on what is required. And we know that many of you are already running through some of your budgeted funds for reopening, especially around cleaning and safety protocols. And as a result, you may know that there has been quite a push lately to have an additional stimulus bill. You could call it CARES 2, and those negotiations are continuing. In addition to the COVID-related responses to reopening, we're also making you aware of our homework gap advocacy push here to include $4 billion for emergency educational connections in the stimulus response bill that's being negotiated right now in Washington, D.C. That $4 billion would be directed towards schools and libraries to allow them to purchase devices to give to students. Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, and Wi-Fi enabled devices to help kids learn at school during the pandemic and then afterwards. And that's especially important for the kids who we know in rural and high poverty areas do not have reliable home broadband internet access. We know that connectivity is an issue, that fiber out to that last mile is an issue, but another way to address this is to provide this $4 billion in emergency educational connections. The bad news is, as you may have heard, Congress had sort of a self-imposed deadline that they were going to pass this, I'm just going to call it CARES 2 bill today, and get it to the president for his signature so that they could go home next week and start to campaign for re-election. Well, they have been meeting all week with members of Congress, the Senate, and the House negotiators of both parties and the White House. As of this morning, there had been no deal reached. The Senate, I believe, will come back next week to keep working on this issue. So we'll keep you posted on that, but this might be a good opportunity for you to make sure to contact Senator Roberts, Senator Moran, and your member of Congress in the House to tell them that your schools and your communities need that stimulus funding, including for K-12 and for city and county governments. So that is a quick update on the federal situation and kind of the way it's bogged down. We'll keep you posted on that through our communications channels, but this is a great opportunity for you to contact Congress. Maybe you're already going to contact them about stimulus funding or paycheck protection or student loan forgiveness. Here's another item that you could hit on as Congress looks to be back in the districts here over the next couple of weeks with or without a new stimulus deal. Any questions on federal advocacy issues?
Leah, I might just note, I had a question earlier today that I think was just from someone who, you know, all those acronyms and, well, what's the difference
Yes.
between the CARES Act and the HEROES Act? And
Yes.
remember, what we've been explaining is the funding that's been approved. The HEROES Act is the House passed version of what you're calling CARES 2.
Right.
It's what hasn't passed. I don't remember the acronym of the Senate bill, but that's why it gets confusing.
Right.
But one key difference between the two is that the House version has a lot of money that would go to states to make up for their budget shortfalls. The Senate bill does not. And so, you know, you remember earlier in the summer, I was telling you all about how bad our state budget situation was. And then Governor Kelly was able to come up with a plan that, you know, at least for now, would avoid deep cuts. But a lot of that is kind of using one-time money, which is good, but it's sort of pushed some of that problem another year down the road. Of course, if the economy rebounds, things will look better. But I think we still very much believe that Kansas is going to face serious budget issues if there isn't federal assistance to backstop that. And that's one of the major points of debate right now at the federal level. Do we step in and do that or not?
That's right, Mark. The HEROES Act basically is the House position, House of Representatives, and that is $3 trillion. The Senate's bill is called the HEALS Act, which is health education. I can't remember what the A stands for, and liability protection and something. That's the Senate position, which is basically the Republican position, and that proposal has it's been floated, has about $1 trillion in overall funding levels. So you can see the two sides are pretty far apart, and they have not.
$2 billion.
Yes. So they're pretty far. So they're pretty far apart, and we'll just have to keep you posted on that.
Okay, we'll just wrap up. There will be a few minutes if anyone has questions you haven't gotten to, and you're welcome to use the chat for this. This is just kind of our regular request. If there are issues and concerns that you think should be priorities of KASB's advocacy efforts with the legislature, the state board, or Congress, we'd love to hear from them. Our legislative committee will hold its first meeting the last Saturday in August. So that's when we'll begin talking about it, but we want to make sure we're reflecting your concerns. We'll have one more of these meetings in 2 weeks before that time, and of course we'll continue. But just again, if anyone has any concerns or questions about issues right now, you can put them in the chat. You can send them to us directly. We'll also be, as we get closer, publicizing in our publications our legislative committee members by region. And of course, you can always contact us directly, but we're certainly wanting to know. And, you know, it's interesting because one of the things we go back and forth on, I thought was interesting that Representative Murnan talked about, is everyone is concerned about funding, but sometimes when you say, well, do you need more funding? Well, I mean, we don't even know we don't even know how to spend it. So part of the thing that we have to do is there is a concern about, are we going to have enough money to open safely? We need to be identifying what those costs are. And if that's a problem, we need to be able to specifically talk about what it would be. Likewise, if there's things that you see as barriers or problems in state law, in state regulations, experiences that you have as you try to reopen, we need to hear about what they are, because we can't advocate to fix them if we don't hear specifically what they are. So that's what we'll be listening for, particularly over the next few weeks as you actually start to reopen. So let me open it up to see if there's a final round of questions for anyone. From anyone? Well, we apologize for the technical difficulties, but that just happens in the world of Zoom. So I'm sure many of you all experienced this. We will be planning to be back in 2 weeks. I forget what the date of that is, but just 2 Fridays from now. And if history is any guide, there'll be a whole lot of additional information then. So, oh, looks like we are seeing a chat. Oh, it's a thank you. So we will take those. Okay, thank you. I want to thank our presenters, particularly Monica Murnan, for joining us. And you know, you did so well. And I guess the final thing I would say. So she said she's a viewer who never dreamed she'd be a guest. So that's an opportunity for all of our regulars. You too can get on. I guess
that's right.
Demonstrate a good reason why. So let us know if you want to be a special participant, and we'll keep that in mind. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Good luck with your next couple weeks opening school or getting ready, and we will see you then.